the seaborne empires of Britain and France were struggling for world hegemony. Now, the point I want to make here is simply this. Once Naples and Cairo, or southern Italy, the Mezzogiorno, southern Italy and Egypt are inserted into the maps provoked by these planetary processes sustained by maritime powers, it becomes impossible to reduce their histories to a local accounting of time. And this is just brought home. This is simply a map from the beginning of the 20th century, which brings home the centrality of the fact that the Mediterranean is fundamentally a colonial lake, beginning in Morocco and going all the way through to Syria and onto what was then known as Persia, that is Iran, all under European control and domination, all the way through to India. So the Mediterranean as a European lake. At the same time, the centrality of the sea disseminates an unstable element to the equation or the equations of European modernity. The sea, the encounter with other horizons of sense, interrupts the facile or the easy evaluations of a linear mapping of time and space. The sea is unstable, it's disruptive, it's difficult to map, to control. So these linear mappings of time and space, disciplined by the landlocked desires of unilateral development and a homogeneous modernity that is inevitably presumed to be the property of Europe. This is disturbed by the sea, by sea travel, by encounters at sea. So to this idea of a possible maritime criticism, challenging historicism, challenging the idea that time develops purely in a linear manner, in a progressive manner, we can propose this idea of the maps of an unstable sea of histories. Unstable sea of histories. And to this idea of these maps of an unstable sea of histories, I want later to add the disturbing disposition of art. Art as a form of disturbance, disturbing this idea of linearity, of progress, of European historicism, the idea that time can be mapped, explained, controlled. So this will introduce the idea of art not as an aesthetical witness, as aesthetic witness to the past and the present, but art rather as an affective and ethical configuration of a time that is neither homogeneous nor simply the property of progress. So with this, I want to move to the next section, which is simply called the challenge of the sea. So to think about the challenge of the sea, to think about challenge of water, the fact it cannot be easily fixed, stabilized, enclosed, is to talk about the ontological challenge of water as opposed to the rootedness in the ground beneath our feet. And this, so to think about the challenge of water forces the adoption of fluid coordinates, fluid forms of coordination that require continual navigation and negotiation. And this, of course, is to adopt the prospect of routes rather than routes. That is, routes as a passageway across horizontal surfaces, movement, as opposed to the things that trees have, being rooted in the ground. Roots rather than roots. This is a proposal that has been elaborated by the critical anthropologist James Clifford, and above all by the black British sociologist Paul Gilroy. So to adopt this prospect of roots rather than roots also suggests a hydropolitics of a radically more extensive kind than that associated merely with the management of water as a resource and as an accessory to human activities. It's to bring it in from the margins, the idea of water as merely something you cross in terms of trade, in terms of using it as resources for fishing, etc. It is to propose an understanding of water, of the sea, or at least an acknowledgement that exceeds our framing and explanatory powers. Something that exceeds our framing and explanatory powers. In other words, I am not simply working with a liquid metaphor, but rather proposing an image of thought that is tied, for example, to the materiality of the Mediterranean Sea and its associated cultures and histories as they crisscross its surfaces, leaving traces and deposits in its depths. In this in-between water, in-between, Mediterranean, in-between water, that simultaneously unites and divides three continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe, we are encouraged to move from the plane of the metaphor into the itineraries, into the journeys of a maritime modality of thought. So I want to take you back 1,000 years. This is a coronation cloak prepared by Arab artisans in the royal workshops in Palermo, in Sicily, for the coronation of a Christian monarch, Roger II. Now, we know when it was the year of its production, which is 1134, because it's written in Arabic along the edges of the cloak itself. So we have this image, if you like, suggests all the cultural and historical complexities that contemporary nationalisms refuse to acknowledge or seek to avoid. Roger II, a Christian Norman prince, clothed in the languages of Arab and Muslim power. This underlines the noted theme of overlapping territories and intertwined histories proposed by the Palestinian critic Edward Said. Okay. So this cloak, we could elaborate a whole different history of the Mediterranean, beginning from the material provocation of his coronation cloak of 1132 of Roger II. Now this is to challenge this idea of intertwined histories and overlapping territories, in this case in Palermo, only recently reconquered from the Arabs by the Normans. This is to challenge inherited considerations of the sea as an accessory to and an extension of territorial imperatives by proposing its provocative centrality in the makings of the modern world. Here, significant connections are to be made between the world systems, and I'm talking about 1,000 years ago, the world system sustained by the classical and medieval Muslim Mediterranean and pre-European Indian Ocean trade, where it's possible to travel, to trade from Spain to southern India using Arabic, when the major world cities at the time were, of course, Cairo and Baghdad. And this connects, if you like, to the later world systems which would come to be organized around the Atlantic after the 16th century. So this idea of these bodies of water proposing world systems, not simply of trade, but of course also of cultural and historical intertwinings and overlappings. All our bodies of water that not only sustain transnational systems of trade, but also composed complex cultural ensembles or cultural assemblages that radically transformed the histories of their surrounding shores and hinterlands. The idea of maritime criticism and its evocation of an inconclusive and unsteady framing of histories promoted by the insistence of the sea is precisely a radical attempt to rework those archives associated with fixed territories, fixed ideas of belonging, and the associated stability of their knowledges from the floating prospects of a maritime perspective. In other words, the sea is here considered not merely as a surface that permits movement and migration between territorial reference, I don't know, from the southern shore of the Mediterranean, from North Africa into Europe today, just as it once permitted the movement out of rural Europe to the Americas, the so-called New World, 200, 300 years ago. It's not only that, but the sea itself becomes a site and source of migrating histories and intertwining cultures. It is in this arduous and agonistic combination of communication and difference, of shared encounters and marked distinctions, of resonance and dissonance, that, just remaining within the context of the Mediterranean, that the Mediterranean proposes a multiplicity seeding modernity with the challenge and the chaos of complexity. For the idea of the sea as a potential plane of immanence proposes the laboratory of another modernity. Here the hegemonic time and space of capital is viewed askance, or viewed from a different angle. At the same time, it is viewed from a different angle, it is diverted and subverted or deviated. The sea becomes what Michel Foucault calls a heterotopic space, not utopic, not there in the future, alongside us, beside us, proposing a series of unauthorized questions. So, centrality of the sea and the ship to the making of Occidental modernity might fruitfully suggest that we set modernity on floating foundations. We set modernity itself on floating foundations. We wrench it away from fixed points of reference. Thinking of the centrality of the sea and of the ships to the making of Western modernity. So folding modernity's assumed stability back upon itself, which might allow us, for example, to read the Grundrisse, or the initial sketch of Marx's Capital, to read it through Herman Melville's novel Moby Dick, or to read Moby Dick through the Grundrisse, or vice versa. Or this all leads to the creation of an unsuspected critical space when modernity goes offshore, is at sea, goes to sea and finds itself at sea. Given